Catus Maximus here. This time we're reviewing and discussing unique, specialty, and less common sockets. Trying to finish up on a lot of my hand tool, or excuse me, my interchangeable socket reviews, and I got through a bunch of them, but I still had different reviews to still do here and there, and so I'm kind of piecing them in. And that's what this is. Covers the range from 1/4 inch through inch drive. And these are the less common or more specialty sockets. I'm also including the external Torx, or the E drive you can see here. The external star, because I didn't think I had enough to really do a video dedicated to E-Torx. And you do see them like on Ford brake calipers and on hydraulic pumps and that kind of stuff. But they're not particularly common. But perhaps are more so nowadays. Let's go ahead and start with this 1/4 inch area. We have one of these. This is a right angle, kind of a smooth action right angle driver for 1/4 inch drive. Actually, I watched a video from one of my subscribers and they had one of these, so they'll recognize it. How this works is it has a heavy center pin that's locked in via two press fit solid pins. And then these outer arms are just hardened tool steel polished, and they telescope in and out. There's 5 of them. And as you put torque on this, they want to bend over, but since they're held so deeply, they don't bend, so the force ends up trying to translate and cause it to rotate. These don't really like heavy loads. They're certainly not impact rated. That would just bend these rods and then the thing would jam up. And that's one of the issues, is if you overload it and you bend these rods, then it'll get real stiff where that bend is. And that's always a hassle. So it's kind of an interesting design. The idea behind it is, if you didn't have an air ratchet or something, that once you broke a bolt that was kind of in a more compact space, that you could put a nut driver or a spinner handle on the end of this and then spin out the fastener a little more easily. Although I don't find myself really using it that much. It's one of the more unique pieces here. I also have a small collection of these, and you'll run into these in various junk bins, but these are the security lug nut sockets. Like, this is a Gorilla lug nut, and then these are some different types of specialty ones. There's a whole range of these, and so once I started thinking about it, I figured I'd start collecting them. Just for the instances when you're helping a friend and they may have lost the key to their specialty lug nut. That is particularly common when you buy a used car. You don't really notice. Maybe somebody who's not well versed in automobiles won't notice that maybe one of the lug nuts is a security lug nut, and then now they can't pull off the wheels. And so this is kind of nice. One thing that they do try to do with the security lug nuts that use the tooth, or what I call asymmetrical spline design, is that they have all sorts of different patterns, and you can see there's subtle differences. Like, this has a double there, this one has no double. And that's something to be aware of, is those external spline types where the splines aren't evenly spaced. That actually acts like a specialty key and prevents just one socket from fitting everybody's security lug nuts, which has always been kind of the criticism of these Gorilla lug nuts. They're really nice because they fit in the tight spaces, but they're just one common style. And a little tip for people: when the auto shop, or particularly the tire shop, may not have the specialty one for your lug nut, what they do is they have sacrificial impact sockets, and they just find one that's a little bit smaller than your lug nut. And I've seen this where they just pound the socket on. Sometimes they'll even use really large E-drive sockets, pound it on, use it as an extractor, and just pull out the lug nut. Well, I always thought that was kind of amusing. So we have the external Torx, which is often found on, say, Ford brake calipers. They're getting a little more common on automobiles, but we have 1/4 inch versions, both the Lyle and the Harbor Freight, so you can kind of compare them. The Lyles are really heavy duty and really thick. I don't know how they're going to wear. But it's just kind of nice to compare both brands. And let's dump those down there. What we have here is tap sockets. So the drive squares on taps are increase as the tap size increases. So they don't have like set specific wide increments such as drive sizes, 1/4 inch and 3/8. And so they make sockets, which oftentimes make it easier to drive a tap, because you can use sliding T-handles, you can use ratchets where you're in tight situations, and makes running taps quite a bit easier. You can use one of the universal swivels, which helps the tap stay straight. That can be a big deal and prevent you from breaking taps. And you know they're a tap socket because they are a square drive, but it's down deep, and then they're undercut, and they have an O-ring. These are Lyles, and they usually come as a set. This set came with 8 pieces. It was 4 1/4 inch and then 4 3/8 inch. Of course, we have the 1/4 inch drive. These are just for driving different tips, 1/4 inch hex tips. And so I just got through reviewing a bunch of those. So it's nice to have all those tips and then be able to put them on, hand tools. The most common sizes are this type. Some are magnetic. A lot just have a lock ring. And then there are the, I would call, more heavier duty version where they actually have a set screw. And I really like them. This is an old Craftsman here. And some of the more specialty sockets you might find would be these down here. Now there's lots of sockets where their drive tips, they're 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch flathead, and I've done reviews on those. What makes these more unique is they're actually just all tool steel. And they end up being quite expensive. This little 1/4 inch Phillips is a pretty expensive little bit. Same thing with this little flathead bit. But they're always kind of nice to add to a collection. And then one advantage that you get with these is they can be much more compact than any kind of adapter and bit. And then of course they have those in flathead as well. These are actually pretty expensive for flathead screwdrivers, but they are great for set building. And then here's a real specialty one. I've never seen anything like this before. But as soon as I found this one, I'm eventually going to buy a set. But that was a super short ball end socket, hex drive, 1/4 inch drive socket. So just to give you an idea. I also have these down here, and we can compare all of them together. Now they're called socket drivers or hex socket drivers, and they're kind of weird. And what these are all designed to do is to pop into the back of a socket, so you can use a wrench on the back of a socket in a particular situation where you just need a certain amount of reach. To tell you the truth, I haven't used them much, but they seem to be fairly common. And that's really all they are, is they're just a hex. Like this is a 5/8 hex, and it just snaps into a socket. So you can drive the socket with a wrench, or you could drive a socket with another socket, which is a little redundant. Actually, let me put some of these down so we can compare the different brands here. I have a couple different generations of Craftsmans, and then we have a couple different Harbor Freight units. And I was going to do a video about these two Harbor Freight units, the sets, but I decided not to. I'll include it here. So Harbor Freight does have an interesting one, which is this style. It has a lock ring in it, so you can put this into a box wrench or into a flex head ratcheting box wrench, and then it allows you to convert your box wrench into a ratchet. And what's nice about these is that now you can drive, for instance, this. You can use a 3/4 inch ratcheting box wrench, which is very thin, and then drive a 1/2 inch socket. Once you've broken the bolt, then you can use this to easily ratchet it out. Obviously, many situations you wouldn't be able to break many bolts because a 1/2 inch drive is going to be so much stronger than any 3/4 inch box wrench. But they certainly are handy. And then the Harbor Freights are nice with the little snap ring, and then they are quick release, which I also appreciate quite a bit, because then they lock in, the socket's locked into it, and you don't have to worry about it all falling apart. And then they have a more traditional one like this, which I don't know, they're not rated as impact grade, although I'm sure they're impact rated, and that's just another socket drive. With the Craftsmans, we can see that the quality has gone down. What we have is the old generation, we have a new generation. So these right here were probably made in the 90s. This was made in the 2000s. And we can see the metal seems pretty good, but it just isn't quite as defined. There's an odd depression there. You can see the stamping isn't quite as crisp. And one of the biggest differences here is like the centering of the stamp that retains the ball. You can see how badly off-centered it was here, where this one's much better centered. And just to compare, even great brands, as they get older, they do become a little cheaper. Let's go ahead and move on down here. We've talked about the tap sockets. That's those. We also have 3/8 inch drives. Same deal. These are just Phillips and slot head bits, but they're all tool steel and integrated. These are what are known as Weatherhead sockets. So if you've ever worked on, it's air fittings and hydraulic fittings, oftentimes they'll have 90-degree elbows. And so Weatherhead sockets are actually sockets designed to work with those elbows on various air fittings and hydraulic fittings. This is just a 4-piece set, but there are whole master sets made of these. They're very common, and they're available all online through a variety of manufacturers. This is a little 4-piece snap-on set. And to tell you the truth, I do use box wrenches pretty often. when I'm working with air fittings. But the nice thing about sockets is obviously they get in the spaces and recesses that box wrenches can't. They're also the type of socket that technically they would be the easiest for you to home fabricate, because you just get a donor set, preferably impact sockets, so they'll have thicker walls, and then you could just grind out various slots of various widths. They wouldn't be as good as a purchase one, but technically as far as making homemade sockets, I mean, that's what these are. They're just really thick, and then they just have a slot cut into them of specific sizing. Let's continue on with external Torx, and that's exactly what they are. They are Torx or star drive, but external, where the bolt is the star and then the socket is the mirror image of it. And these are some Harbor Freight deep wells. We have some Powerbuilt short wells. We have some Lyles here, and some Harbor Freights actually as redundant ones. One thing that is a little bit odd is the sizing for external Torx is not the same as it is for internal Torx. So when you're using standard star bits, none of the star bits will actually fit tight into any of these sockets. It's a little bit odd. I don't understand the way Torx sizing works in the first place, but it's even increasingly odd that like an E10 Torx external socket has no relation to a T10. Obviously, this is about 6 millimeters, 7 millimeters, and a T10 is like 2 millimeters. So that was always curious to me. But they are handy, and if you they are used quite a bit more on vehicles, particularly like where I've experienced them the most is Fords. And surprisingly enough, hydraulic pumps and motors, it seems oftentimes they'll use this drive. I think more as an alternative to using socket head cap screws in environments that are particularly dirty, because it can be difficult to clean out and get a hex wrench into a socket head cap screw. So they use external Torx because it's easier to clean out. When you put a socket on, it just pushes the gunk out of the slots. And then, of course, we have an OTC set here, which is the largest one. This is the biggest one I've seen, which is an E24. Although online I've seen as far as I own, or actually even seen in the store. So they do get through quite large sizes. And these kind of things are when you run into a large size and you don't have the specific socket, you're just not removing the fastener. Because usually an E-Torx is going to be a pretty high torque fastener. We'll go and do this other socket strip here. This has some things people have already seen, which is, hex driver bits. The ones that are more unique, such as this Williams, which are all machined one-piece tool steel, are more expensive, but I always kind of like them. But I understand doing them this style, because what you have is you have the tool steel for the socket, and then you have an extremely hard steel for the hex, which is really what you want. But the super hard steel for the hex wouldn't be the greatest for the sockets, because they would want to break. And many of these can be replaced, such as this snap-on here. You can see they have a little roll pin, so there's a little hole drilled through there. The Proto right here I really like, because it uses a set screw. So if this breaks, you can always, usually it'll break down. It'll either break right at the end of the fastener or it'll break right at the end of the socket. And either way, if it breaks right at the end of the fastener, you just dig out the piece and continue to use it. But if it breaks at the socket, the nice thing is you just need a little Allen wrench. You can knock out the broken off piece and then stick the rest of the hex back into there and continue to use it. And I thought that was actually quite genius. And then we have sockets for those clutch drives. We've talked about those. We have this style socket. I have no idea what it's for. But it's a very interesting kind of special fitting socket. And then, of course, in 3/8 we have various 1/4-inch drive hex adapters. We have impact grade. These really thick ones are for hand impact drivers. We have just various impact grades. Here's an old Williams, which is for 5/16, so that would be the same size as this. Many times the hand impact drivers are a little larger, but this Williams has a set screw. And then we also have 1/4-inch versions. And we've talked about the Gator Grip before. That's the universal socket. And then, of course, the brake cubes. These are for rear brakes on vehicles that have the parking brake is integrated into the caliper instead of having a separate drum brake, which I never really understood. Moving on, there are those triple square or 12-point internal, but they don't call them 12-point internals because the definition of 12-point would be based off angles of a hex, And these are triple square because all the angles are actually 90 degrees on these points. And so that's something to keep in mind. These are seen a lot on Audis now, and it's becoming more common to have security versions. So these are our large Titan 3-piece large set, and I picked these up because I figured if I ever run into one of those, there's no way to get out. Oops, had a little interruption there. Anyway, continuing with this, this was odd. This actually came with some type of Harbor Freight set, I forget, but this is a Pittsburgh. It was made pretty well, and it is a 1/2-inch drive to 1/4-inch hex, quick release adapter. And I thought it was a bit amusing because using a 1/2-inch drive against a 1/4-inch hex is a bit overkill, to tell you the truth, by a wide margin. But I figured it'd be pretty handy because if you have anything stubborn, at least you have an adapter where the only thing that could fail is the fastener or the bit. And we'll talk about Draggling sockets here. Draggling sockets look like short flathead, just kind of oversized heavy-duty flatheads. And technically they're not. They're for rear axle suspension systems and adjusting them. But they are handy to have because they are essentially just very large flatheads. And so if we take a look at these, we have a range of sizes here and brands, some Snap-on and Proto and Mac. And so they just are sold by their width. This is a Proto. Some are a little different than others. I like this design here with the Proto because they try to make it really short to give it just a little bit of extra strength. Although in some situations that can also be a hindrance because it doesn't seat all the way into the slot. But that's just what they are. They're real simple. This is a much older one. And they get large. This would be a Mac 1-inch draw, 1 inch wide. And this large Draggling socket or flathead has been surprisingly handy. I've done a review on a Tecton really huge 3/4-inch long by 3 foot, or 3/4-inch drive by 3 foot long breaker bar, and I've used that with this to actually split. Actually, I had one situation where I was trying to get a machine component off and it just wouldn't come out, so I managed to get it a gap, and I put this in there with that big breaker bar and was able to get the components apart, and then noticed that I had not removed one of the bolts, but this did break it. Also surprisingly handy is in irrigation work. There'll be large plastic covers which have just a big slot head in it, and these are handy for removing those as well. But if you ever wondered what those oversized flathead sockets were, they are Draggling sockets. I talked about the Weatherhead sockets. There are other sockets that look similar to Weatherheads, which are these, which really are just a round socket with a slot kind of in it. But this is for removing those arms, the ball arms, say at the end of a steering rack. They have the little ball joint that connects to the suspension. And these are what you would use to actually unscrew them quickly and easily. Oftentimes I've used this with an impact wrench, as you can see, and it's wallowed out, but that's kind of nice because it holds it onto the little bolt that sticks through. But it's just a cup that goes over the end of the knuckle. The bolt sticks through here and it actually just presses against the bolt and makes it a lot easier to remove those joints. And of course install them as well. Then we have specialty sockets. This is for I'm not exactly sure which, but I want to point out because oftentimes people will see, or you will see, sockets that are either shaped like this or they're the mirror image where there's just little posts. And those are for lock rings, oftentimes on 4-wheel drive hubs of trucks, where they have the whole 4-wheel drive system, and then to set the tension on the wheel bearings, they have a special lock ring which has a design similar to that. We also have these kind of things, which are a 1/2-inch drive chain wrench. It's actually become quite handy, and so that was just kind of to show that technically this is a socket. It doesn't, drive specifically a fastener, but you connect it to your 1/2-inch drive, and then you can technically, well, I guess you could drive some fasteners in some situations, but it's really great for, especially for working with pipes, because now you can use 1/2-inch drive tools and extensions and breaker bars and remove and install pipes in a variety of tight situations much more easily. Really a surprisingly handy tool is a 1/2-inch drive chain wrench, and I want to get a whole set 1/4-inch through inch drive. Speaking of 3/4-inch and inch drive, what we have here is these square drive sockets, which also don't seem to make sense because they would seem to be like couplers. But no, these are known as spud nuts. And so on trucks where you have dualies, you'll have a regular lug nut that holds the outside wheel on. And when you remove the lug nut, there are bolts which have a big shoulder, which is what holds the inside wheel on. Those bolts have a square head, usually 13/16, but they do vary in sizes. And then you would use a socket like this, which is known as a spud nut socket, to pull those out. Here I have a 3-piece set, and you can see which ones really do get used the most. We have both. We have the standard 13/16 here, and then we have a 21mm, which is pretty close to 13/16. What's interesting is they have a type of fluting or little cutouts on the 19mm. I'm not exactly sure why that is. But these are inch drive, and you can see they have extremely thick walls. These are the kind of sockets that will be in use until they completely get rounded out. What's also amusing here is we have a 17mm square, so that's a 17mm square on an inch drive socket, and so they didn't taper down the socket at all, and so this one's quite amusing. As you can see by my finger, this socket has some of the thickest walls I've ever seen proportionately, or even not proportionately. There's very few sockets that have walls that are, 3/8 of an inch thick or nearly 10 millimeters thick. It's pretty amazing to see those, and it's always kind of fun because people say, oh, I've seen some thick wall sockets, and you bring out this, and pretty much nothing will have walls thicker than that. The drive end will fail before this fails. And finally, last but not least, we have some deep wells. Well, why would I bring out deep wells? Here is what we considered a standard length 3/4 inch drive deep well. This is an extra deep 3/4 inch drive deep well. And then what we have down here is actually a 1/2 inch drive, but this is a super deep well. And this 1/2 inch drive is even taller than the extra tall 3/4 inch drive. These are not very common because they're really expensive because you're paying for a lot of steel. They're obviously really heavy. And with the use of extensions, there's very few situations where you really need a socket that has so much depth. But they are available, particularly in situations where you do have to run nuts down an extensive amount of threaded rod. And you need a socket to do that. You either use one of those through sockets, or you have to use an extra deep well. And one thing I did want to point out about quality sockets, this one has been used quite a bit, and if I can get some light in here. Here we go. This socket is very heavily used. This was not a fluted socket. It started out with square corners, and it's actually been just hammered so much that the corners, now it looks like it is a fluted socket. Focus. Another thing I wanted to point out is if I turn this, you can see down in there that there's a shelf. So this socket has been worn so much it's almost a 1/16 of an inch larger than it used to be. But still the walls have not failed, and the drive is wearing gracefully. Same here. This was not fluted, but you can see that there's now this curvature as the square impact wrenches really just started to run these out. What happens in the long term is the squares wear out first. That's what my experience has generally been, is that I've seen sockets where the square is been totally ground out. It's been drilled as a circle. But whenever I see a socket that maybe the wall has split while there's still a useful square and there isn't much wear internally, then it really wasn't a good brand. And I've run into a couple of those recently where people are saying sockets would fail at the wall, and that really isn't true, especially with impact. It may be more true with chrome and hand tool sockets, but a good impact socket should just operate until it is physically stripped out. Anyway, that was the end of this longer review of specialty and unique sockets. I really appreciate everybody watching. Let me not forget to talk about these. We've talked about spline drive sockets where they drive all these different sizes, metric and standard. Well, these are a much older and a more original type of universal socket, and what they look like is a socket where this pattern right here is what this socket will eventually look like if it's used in the shop for many, many more years, which is kind of interesting. But it just has some flutes. Let me get some more light on there. And how these work is where spline sockets appear to be more sized to be tight on metric fasteners, and they happen to work on imperial. These are sized to be tight on imperial fasteners and happen to work on metric. and I only ever found 3 of them, but they actually are advertised. Like this is 13 millimeter and 1/2 inch. This one right here would be 12 millimeter and 15/32, which is kind of an odd size. And then this one would be 11 millimeter and 7/16. And being a 6-point version, they do work much better. And what I mean by this is sized for an imperial fastener. We have a 12 millimeter metric fastener, and if we look, the fastener is loose, the socket is loose on that, but when you get to tightening it, if I can get this camera to really focus in there, let me see if I can't get a light on the situation at the same time. Whoop. Here we are. You can see how the socket still presses pretty far in from the corners because of the deep flutes. Had the flashlight on my chin there. And so this is a style that I would recommend and would approve of, because they really are still a flank drive when they're driving either size fastener. And it's a shame that these didn't become more common. They're obviously, with the thicker fluting, they're going to be much heavier duty than a spline drive socket. The last couple of things before I forget to mention them, this is a genuine Jacobs chuck. Here. There it is. And this is a 1/2 inch drive hand tightening 3-jaw chuck, and it's always kind of interesting to be able to mount something up in a chuck and then drive it with some type of 1/2 inch drive. I've only used that a couple times. Really, it's been for larger drill bits. This will accept up to 1/2 inch drill bits, to use them as kind of hand reamers and using a sliding T handle. But I thought that of anything that's unique, it's a 1/2 inch drive 3-jaw chuck. The other thing is this came with a nut runner that I don't have anymore, but this is a 7/16 quick release to 1/2 inch drive. And out of all my specialty and older sockets, this one is the most relevant even today, because 7/16 hex ended up becoming a standard for driving wood augers and many type of woodworking bits. It's really surprising, and so this size ended up just maintaining a big standard. And the reason this has become so handy for me, and I'll show you, is things like these self-feed bits. Sometimes you'll get in a situation where they get bound up and then jammed really hard, and it can be pretty rough on the drill, and even you trying to run it in reverse and hammer it out of there. And I've used this oftentimes just exactly for that, just to take this and use a big breaker bar to get it unjammed, or a 1/2 inch drive ratchet. Even high speed ones, they're all this hex, even though you wouldn't use that with this. This is a style that wouldn't get jammed up. But they're kind of a tidbit for future videos. I really like accessories as much as I like tools. Obviously with power tools you have to have accessories. So we'll still have plenty of videos even after I run out of pliers and stuff to talk about. We can talk about accessories. This is a high performance ship auger that has carbide teeth. It's rated for running at very high speeds. The most common time I've actually used that is with these. Oftentimes I'll be using these ship augers. I won't pull them out as often as I need to clear out the chips. You're just trying to get a hole done. Obviously with these large ship augers, you're drilling deep holes, and so they take a lot of time, and so you're just trying to get through it, and then inevitably you didn't pull it out enough, and enough wood chips get in there to where it really jams up. And oftentimes you can reverse them out, but sometimes it just doesn't. Maybe the wood shifts a little bit because you drilled through some knots or something, and it's really caused it to bind up. And I've had these things really get so stuck, and this was the savior. I couldn't use an adjustable end wrench because the flats weren't wide enough just for the two flats of an adjustable end wrench. But with this socket, you could just put on the socket and use a big old breaker bar. Anyway, finally, we're done talking about specialty and unique sockets and random tools. I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. We'll have lots more tool videos to come. Catus Maximus out.